Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manuel Veth, he's Stefan Bienkowski, and Stefan, how's the week been treating you? It's been a long one. I know we both are dealing with market value updates and Transfermarkt, so it's been a ton of content and it seems never ending. So other than that, how is it going?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. Looking forward to a lot of Bundesliga football this weekend. Some really exciting games, which we won't be talking about on this show, but luckily there's even more games besides that, which we will be talking about. As our paid subscribers know, we already covered the Bayern versus Leverkusen game on our bonus show this week. So if you're looking for coverage of that, do head over to our Substack. But on this one, we'll be doing something a little different, won't we?
Yeah, I mean, this is the great thing about changing this preview show to going away from, let's analyze 2 minutes of every game to, hey, let's pick storylines instead. And that means we can play around with the format every week. And this week you came up with the great idea of asking our listeners for some questions. You did that over on the Substack this is something that our paid subscribers can contribute to. So if you're not one yet and you wanted to ask a question, well, you have to sign up. That's just how it is. But we had some excellent questions. I would say some from our regulars, some from people who haven't asked yet. So let's go through those to preview this match day, because those questions were excellent. And I think they also lead into the storylines that we thought of picking up anyways. And as you mentioned, if you're looking for the biggest storyline, Bayern against Bayer, the Goaltoberfest, as the DFL has labeled it, let's hope there is lots of goals, has been previewed already, and that's on the Substack as well. So Stefan, shoot away.
Yeah, so we had quite a lot of questions. We had some that we ended up covering in the Europa League roundup because they were on Hoffenheim and Frankfurt. So Miss Frau Schallenberger asked the question about Frankfurt, and obviously we'll cover that. We covered that in the Europa League coverage on the bonus show, which I know she would have listened to because she's a paid subscriber. So I don't mind saying head over there and listen to that instead. And we also had a bunch of questions about, well, not a bunch, but some about Hoffenheim, looking ahead to Sunday's game. For Brian, for example, who said Hoffenheim and Bremen are both struggling. Bremen have the fewest goal attempts so far this season and didn't really do much in the off-season. Though they picked up a point against Dortmund and 3 against Mainz, who have a relatively solid start. Hoffenheim have only managed to pick up points against Kiel, though they had a tough schedule to start. Which one of these strugglers is going to look better in this game? Is Hoffenheim going to be drained from their pretty poor midweek match? And is the boardroom drama too much for Hoffenheim? And Mike Reed jumps in and says, I'll be in Hoffenheim on Sunday to support Werder. Please tell me it will be a great game and an away win. And I must say, I must commend Mike's support for Werder Bremen if it's taken him all the way to Hoffenheim. That is a commitment. So like I said, we're not going to really focus on Hoffenheim here, Manu, because we obviously covered them in the Europa League show. But it's a good opportunity to talk about Werder Bremen, isn't it?
Well, one thing I do want to say about Hoffenheim, because we did not cover this on the bonus show, is that I admire you for going. I've only driven past the stadium once last May when I went to Kaiserslautern, because it's on the way from Kaiserslautern back to Munich. And the one thing that really stood out was all the planes outside the stadium in Sinsheim, including the Concorde. But yes, let's focus on Bremen, shall we?
Yeah, exactly. Obviously having a very tough time of it. We did kind of cover that annihilation to Bayern Munich last week. A game in which Bremen managed to rack up 0 shots on target and 0 XG.
0.00, so that's like even wilder. I don't think I've ever seen that before my entire life. And I think this is the 4th show I mentioned it, because it's just such an outlier. It's actually a crazy stat, Stefan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely bonkers stat. And I think it actually does kind of get to the crux of the problem for Werder Bremen, is they just aren't seeming to score goals at all, really. And, it's a problem that I'm intrigued to see if they can fix it, because they do have kind of clear goal scorers in this team. They do have clear players who create chances in this team. If you kind of go back to that team last season, which was very good, obviously, Marvin Duksch was the kind of talisman of that side. And he had a lot of kind of players who were quite happy setting him up. Mitchell Weiser is probably the most obvious one. Romano Schmidt was another one. Leonardo Betancourt was another. And I am intrigued to see whether this is going to be a problem that comes down to these players maybe dropping off, or as our subscriber suggested, that maybe they've had a tricky start to the season, because they have looked decent in games. Obviously drew with Augsburg, drew with Dortmund, and you kind of thought, okay, maybe things are working out there. Beat Mainz, and that's not so bad. And then they get thumped off Bayern, but I don't think anyone's really expecting Bayern to or Bremen to go into these games against Bayern and really win them. And when I did take a look at the stats, particularly with Marvin Duksch, because I remember, I think it was the Augsburg game, I think I stuck some money on him to score any time in that game because he had such a great record against him in previous seasons. And he didn't score, but he had a number of chances. And I thought that was quite odd that he looked a little off the ball. And sure enough, if you actually look at his XG per 90, which is, how many chances he creates per game, it's actually higher than it was last season. But for some reason or another, he just hasn't really found the back of the net just yet. But the other thing that's maybe worth noting as well is that his expected assists per 90 have actually dropped quite considerably. His key passes have dropped off as well. So I think he's the kind of player who definitely scores and creates goals in kind of equal measure. Certainly did last year. And he's just looking a little less composed in front of goal, and he's just not really managing to find the back of the net the way that he used to. And equally, I looked at Mitchell Weiss's stats, and they look more or less in line with how he did last season. So I think the underlying stats would suggest to me that Bremen should be more or less okay and should be exactly more or less where they were last season. And it's just maybe that some of these players are just kind of waiting to revert back to the mean. And I suspect against Hoffenheim on Sunday, we'll probably see something like that. I don't think Bremen should go into that game really fearing Hoffenheim by any means. And I think after that defeat to Bayern Munich, they might feel like they have a point to prove, certainly in an attacking sense.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if Ole Werner is going to shake it up a little bit, right? The Duksch and Grö were the two players that started against Bayern Munich, and Kike Top came on off the bench, right? Who's had a really phenomenal start for them in the DFB-Pokal and hasn't been going quite as well since. There's always that kind of initial excitement with players like him. Someone young comes in and scores a bunch of goals against some lower division team in the German Cup, and then it maybe doesn't quite translate in the Bundesliga yet, right? Because he's young and he's previously played for Schalke in the second division. But I think maybe, shaking it up a little bit and bringing in someone like him can give them a new impetus in the attack. I think that you highlighting Marvin Duksch is really important here, right? Because he was a player who was on the verge of being in that national team conversation last year, didn't make the Euros, and I think he's nowhere near the German national team now, considering who's emerged since, right? But, initially when Nagelsmann took over, he was certainly in that, shall we say, stratosphere of national team players, right? Of players that were considered, but has since dropped out. And I think this season we maybe see that he has potentially hit a bit of a ceiling, that, Werder being a striker who scores 10 to 12, 13 goals for Werder Bremen is where he's at. And that's going to come eventually, but, he's not going to be the guy. He's not going to be like a Niklas Füllkrug who's all of a sudden going to emerge late and, go to Dortmund and then be transferred to West Ham for 30 million euros. Like, that's not, I don't think, I'd be shocked if that wasn't his cards, but I don't think that's going to happen. So, with that in mind, there isn't really a top striker in the squad at the moment, right? And so you get these stats of Werder Bremen struggling to score, especially against top sides. Having said that, we did break down the Hoffenheim game on the bonus show, and if I was Werder Bremen and watched the match against Midtjylland, I definitely would have seen enough weaknesses there to address and attack Hoffenheim and maybe finally get a couple goals there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not so far as I'd go so far as to say that Bremen are favourites for this tie. I think it is a bit of a toss-up, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Which sounds like something that Mike Reed might not appreciate me saying, since he's obviously gone all the way there to try and turn things around. But we kind of talked about Bremen's kind of summer transfer windows a few times already this season, in the sense that they've been probably one of the most inactive teams in the Bundesliga in terms of transfer window. That's obviously a question, part of Anders' question, or sorry, Brian's question, and it's obviously something that was either done because the club were obviously just kind of limited with their finances, or because Ole Werner simply said, well, I'm more or less happy with the players that I've got in this team.
Yeah.
And I guess it's just going to be a matter of time to see if that changes. But I mean, you can kind of go through that team, and it's man for man, more or less, a pretty solid mid-table team. I mean, obviously you could always make changes and spend 10, 15 million euros here or there, but Duk's is a good player, Schmidt's a good player, Weiss is a good player. They do have a number of decent players in that team, and I wouldn't be overly worried about Werder Bremen just yet. And I think that maybe those struggles in front of goal will probably resolve themselves, maybe this weekend, but certainly in the weeks to come, I'd imagine.
There's a term in German football to describe a team like Werder Bremen, and it's usually a negative term, although I think Werder Bremen, considering their recent history, would probably take it. They're typical graue Maus, Stefan, a grey mouse. That's how Germans describe teams that are between relegations and European spots. They just kind of exist in the league. They go on, they win a game here, they lose a couple over there, and they're not really in the news because not much is happening. But it's probably, if you're Werder Bremen right now in the stage of where they are as a club, is probably something that they actually kind of like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously they're a fan base who've gone through things in the second division. They've had the torment of relegation, and it's always good to have aspirations, and fans are always kind of ambitious and fickle in equal measure. But I don't think Bremen have to look far to see clubs of equal size who've really struggled and obviously are still struggling. Hamburg's not that far away. Schalke's just a couple of hours down the road. Well, a bit more than a couple of hours, but in the relative same region. And those are two clubs that they used to tussle with for league titles not that long ago. So I think Bremen, historically speaking, are a club that should be top six in my opinion, but a lot's changed. Other clubs have kind of stepped into that role. Leipzig obviously are a team who've kind of made everyone have to step down a spot maybe in the hierarchy of German football, except for obviously Bayern and Dortmund maybe. But I think Bremen, I think Ole Werner's a good head coach. I think he knows what he's doing there, and I'm hoping that inactivity in the summer was down to the fact that he's got a lot of faith in his squad and not just simply a club paddling without or what's the expression, rowing without a paddle or whatever it is, something like that. But yeah, we'll see what happens.
I saw a video today of a kayaker fighting off a shark with a paddle. So
Exactly. It could always be a lot worse.
It could be a lot worse. Boring is good, is what I'm trying to say for Werder Bremen. All right, let's go to the next question.
Yeah, so Anders asks, looking at the table before this match day, it seems very much like the three most obvious candidates for relegation are stuck at the bottom of the table. Do you think we'll see these three battle it out for the rest of the season in terms of who's going to avoid direct relegation and earn a playoff spot? Other than maybe Augsburg, and that's a stretch in my opinion, I really don't see any other team who could slip into the bottom three.
I mean, we did talk about Hoffenheim earlier today, so I would keep my eye on that chaos for a while and how it pans out on the field, Stefan. But so I do have other clubs on the list as well that could slip down there. Augsburg is an obvious one, and Matt and I did talk about that in one of the shows a few weeks ago, where we mentioned that they are a club that we were worried about because of what they lost, right? In terms of Demirovic is the obvious one, but Engels too to Celtic. which is, I think, was kind of like a little bit of a needless transfer. Like they were in the driver's seat here, and I don't quite understand why they did it, right? I mean, and understand that they got a lot of money for it, but it's not like that was something that was needed, right? So anyways, they did it anyways, and so that's a club I think that you have to watch out for. But I do think it's really noticeable that there's Bochum, St. Pauli, and Kiel each with 1 point. And I think every one of those three clubs will be quite happy to be in the relegation playoffs, Stefan. And I think that's not going to change anytime soon, because Holstein Kiel in particular, and I sound like a broken record here because I've said this before, I am very worried about their squad build and the depth that they have. And it seems like this entire team, club, city, region is learning what it is like to be in Bundesliga football on the fly. You know, I understand that the THW Kiel, the handball team, has been one of the most successful organizations in European handball, right? But this is a very different beast, and I think that structurally, it is very, very, very difficult. Be a club like Kiel, come up, and then survive with the players that they have, and so I do think they're going to be down there for a while. I am a little bit more optimistic about Bochum and St. Pauli. I do think there's a bit more depth there, and there's a little bit more knowledge there. And there's also an ability maybe there by the head coach in St. Pauli, and then structurally in Bochum, because Bochum have been there before, right? I mean, this is a club that was supposed to be relegated last season and still somehow managed to survive against all odds. And that can really help you when you are playing 34 games and every single match, every single point is important. In fact, like even losing not by a lot of goals, because goal differential matters, right? So, and that is, I think that can be extremely draining on players and personnel and everyone around you. And then of course there's constant criticism, and it's a real tough battle. And Bochum have done it, now 3 or 4 years? And I think that gives you a huge advantage over some of the other clubs that maybe haven't experienced that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think Bochum do have that, and they even have that experience not to maybe panic if they are kind of in that bottom three going into the last kind of 5, 6, 7 weeks, as we've seen a number of times. I mean, I do kind of think Bochum have maybe lost a bit of what made them Bochum, in the sense that home form, that famous home form, isn't quite what it once was. And I think it's something that hopefully they can maybe rekindle, going forward. But we kind of have to wait and see. But interestingly enough, as you were kind of answering that question, I kind of looked up the expected points in the Bundesliga table, and the 3 teams who are bottom of it right now are Bochum, the bottom, Hoffenheim's second bottom, and then Holstein Kiel third bottom. So that's the bottom 3. Do you want to have a guess who the 3 above them are?
The 3 teams that are above them now?
In the expected points table, so not the actual league table, but the 3 teams above the bottom 3, based on expected points, and expected points is just basically expected goals versus expected goals against, and
I would assume Augsburg, Bremen, and Mainz.
Got 2 out of 3, Bremen and Mainz, but the team in between them is Leipzig. So Leipzig have 8 points, and their expected points are 3.8. So maybe 4, I guess you could call that. But that's quite interesting. But what's also maybe quite interesting is that St. Pauli are in mid-table, and they've got 4.5 expected points. And, as you said, if you kind of look back over the course of their kind of first 4 games, the thing that is quite interesting is that I would definitely categorize their performance as naive, in the sense that, they've been very attacking, but they've also left themselves quite open. I watched all 3 of their first 3 games, perhaps certainly watched the first 2. But in those first 2 games, they were, and I've mentioned this multiple times, but they were basically just kind of came out flying, tried to kind of really blitz their opponents, and then kind of got picked off. In the Augsburg game, if I'm not mistaken, if it's the one I'm thinking of, they were really, really second fiddle to a good Augsburg performance, to be honest with you. But then obviously against RB Leipzig last week, they not only held their own, but their XG was twice that of Leipzig's. So think the thing that St. Pauli fans can maybe take positive from that, not just the point against RB Leipzig, but is also the fact that in just about all the games, except maybe the Augsburg game, they did look okay going toe-to-toe with teams, and they did create chances. They were more or less level with Heidenheim for XG in that opening game, but lost it 2-0. They actually had a higher XG than Union Berlin, but lost that one 1-0. They had 1.05 to Union Berlin 0.64. Against Augsburg, they were well and truly thumped. And then against RB Leipzig, they had 1.67 to Leipzig 0.84. So there's definitely, and that's obviously why their comparable expected points is quite high, is because they are creating chances. It's just not quite, corresponding to goals just yet. And you would kind of hope that would certainly turn things around for them. But then equally, they have played 3 teams who would be probably in the bottom 6, and they didn't take points off any of them. And I do kind of wonder if that's something that might haunt them, because it's not like you can say, well, they had a difficult start, but they've got easier games to come, so they might pick up points there. It's quite the opposite with St. Pauli, where they had the easier games, didn't do the most of them, and then, funnily enough, took a point off Leipzig of all teams. But they definitely have a kind of they'll definitely be thereabouts. But if they can start kind of turning that XG into goals, then they might be okay. But equally, as you said, we're maybe kind of struggling to see where the other kind of contenders are, because it's a very condensed league table this season. There's just above them in the actual table are Wolfsburg and Borussia Mönchengladbach, and I would probably say that both those teams have had a tricky start to the season, but actually look okay. I've watched Gladbach a few times now. I know they've only got 3 points on the board, but I think they've actually been okay in quite a number of games. Equally, Wolfsburg put in a really spirited performance against Leverkusen. It probably should have taken something from that game.
Yeah. And against Bayern too. I think they deserved the draw against Bayern as well.
Yeah. So, Hasenhüttl's obviously still kind of working on that team. It's going to be a tricky transition period for them, but I do think they look okay. So if you take the 2 of them out of the equation, that leaves you with Hoffenheim, Augsburg, Werder Bremen, Mainz, and Heidenheim. And as you said, you could easily see a Hoffenheim getting dragged in there. I think Augsburg actually look okay, so I think they might be okay. Just mentioned Werder Bremen. I think they'll probably turn things around. So maybe Mainz, maybe Heidenheim. But I'd probably still fancy all those teams above the bottom 3 right now. So I guess to answer the question from Anders, they're the bottom 3, and I suspect they'll probably stay that way for the considerable future.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I mean, the considerable future for Bochum is Dortmund. And that's a game that we wanted to highlight, because other than the Saturday evening game, Bayern against Bayer, Dortmund against Bochum is probably the biggest match of the match day, Stefan. It's a derby, in the absence of Schalke. This is the real derby. It's the match between 2 pretty big clubs in a very populous region of Germany, the most populous region of Germany. We did have a question about Borussia Dortmund, so maybe we can tie it right in there, because I do think we should talk a little bit about this match. And we've spoken about Bochum and, the troubles that they have. So on the surface, this should be easy for Dortmund, right? And I actually kind of suspect it might be, because fortunately for Dortmund, it is in Dortmund. We do know that in Bochum, Dortmund don't always look good, but in Dortmund, they usually do. Still, this is going to be a fascinating match. And let's bring in that question about Dortmund, shall we?
Yeah, Dennis asks, will every Dortmund coach be forever under pressure after 4 games in? Probably.
Yeah, especially if they don't win this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was slightly facetious, but it's a funny question, and it's understandable that it seems like Dortmund just kind of go from one kind of drama to the next with their head coaches. But I mean, I think anything but a convincing win here would be quite concerning. If I was a Dortmund fan, if they were to slip up here, then I would be worried, because it's typically, despite everything they've gone through in the last kind of 2 or 3 seasons, they've almost always been able to rely on that home form to get them through games like this. And Bochum at home seems like a perfect palate cleanser after what happened last week against Stuttgart.
Yeah.
We obviously, I wouldn't quite say their last home game against Heidenheim was, convincing is probably the word I'd use, but they still didn't struggle to score goals. And in the opening match day, which I thought they would struggle against, but they dispatched Frankfurt quite convincingly in that game, 2-0, even if they did have to rely on Jimmy Bittens coming on to save the day. But they do tend to get over the line at home far more so than they do on the road. So, yeah, I don't know if I would say Sahin is entirely in trouble just yet. He was kind of laughing at his press conference this week. He seems quite relaxed. I don't think anyone at Dortmund would expect them to go to Stuttgart and win that game. Maybe obviously not to lose it the manner they did, but I don't think that result in itself is something that's going to kind of torpedo his chances of staying at the club. But he obviously has to bounce back from that. The team have to bounce back from that, and they have to go. They have to show a really good performance, I think.
No, absolutely. And this is in a really big game, right? There's bragging rights there. And so while Dortmund are the absolute favorite to win this match, I think it needs to be emphatic because especially after that Stuttgart result. And to answer the question about will every head coach at Borussia Dortmund be under pressure of the match day 4, I'm like, yeah, you're in charge of one of Germany's 2 biggest clubs. And so I think you're under pressure from match day 1. Look at Kompany, the pressure that he was under starting from the moment he was revealed to be the new Bayern Munich head coach. From that second onwards, he was under pressure because he wasn't even the number 1 choice, right? So I think what is true for Bayern Munich is very much true for Borussia Dortmund as well. If you're the head coach of Borussia Dortmund, the expectations are that you win every single game. It's not like being in charge at Stuttgart, at least for now, right? Where, oh my God, we got 76 points. This is incredible. And next year, if we finish top 9, that's amazing, right? It's a little bit of a different pressure than it is at some of the other clubs. And so, yeah, I to answer that question, I think every coach is always under pressure at Dortmund, no matter what the situation is. Jurgen Klopp was under pressure in Dortmund. I remember when he first came in, it didn't look great in the start, and the pressure was there right away. And there's a lot of media in that region too that covers Dortmund, right? Because Schalke isn't in the Bundesliga right now, so a lot of the big media houses that would have maybe split their attention a little bit more in the past focus entirely on Borussia Dortmund. And then you have international media attention as well, which is for Dortmund. We see that on Transfermarkt, right? Whenever Dortmund signs someone, that player trends in the top 10 right away on our side. So this is still a club that gets a lot of attention. And yes, you are always going to be under pressure.
Yeah, exactly. People maybe forget this now, but Klopp left Dortmund because of the pressure before he agreed to move to Liverpool. It's not like he moved from Dortmund to Liverpool. He left Dortmund for a break and then ended up going to Liverpool. So it's a lot of pressure these players are under. These managers are under. But it's because they should be the second biggest club in Germany, the second most successful club in Germany. And as I said in my newsletter this week, I think Nuri Sahin still has a long way to go before he can. Before he has proved to be worthy of being the Dortmund head coach. I think it's I think we talked about this in the main show at the start of the week, so I'm not going to kind of go too much over it again. But it's a problem at the club in the sense that they seem to overlook the managerial position time and time again, and go for kind of quick fixes and easy fixes. And it continues to bite them in the backside. And we have to kind of wait and see what happens with Nuri Sahin. And, I don't think he should be judged solely on one performance against Stuttgart, but it's up to him to prove that was a one-off result and that they can bounce back against a team like Bochum and pick up the points they have to pick up.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next question.
Yeah, so our last question is an interesting one who comes from Matthew, who says, I'd love to hear both of your opinions on Mainz's Jonathan Burkardt. As a Mainz supporter, he's such an important player up front and came back from a pretty serious injury. Just curious if those outside the Mainz bubble realise how important he is to the success of the club. could Mainz crack the top half of the Bundesliga season, or am I dreaming? So that's Matthew, presumably Jonathan Burkardt's agent, asking a very important question. Does anyone know who this guy is? Has anyone paying attention? Yeah, of course we know who Jonathan Burkardt is. One of the fantastic young striker. I don't know if we can still call him young, actually. How old is he?
He's 24. That's young enough.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. He's got 3 goals in his first 4 games for Mainz. Manu, I would go so far as to say he is invaluable to this Mainz team right now. And I'll tell you why, because not only is he more or less their sole goal scorer in this team, and to be fair, they do have some decent players. Amiri's, player obviously picked up from Leverkusen, started well. He's got 2 goals in 4 games, but Burkhardt is undoubtedly the kind of player. He's a talisman. As Matthew said, he came back from a very serious injury. Last season, he picked up 10 goals and assists. Season before, or 2 seasons before that, he got 14. And I think he could prove to be very important to them because, and this kind of ties into the very end of his question, asking if he's dreaming of a top half finish. I suspect that might be quite difficult, only because Mainz, while they have scored 8 goals in 4 games, they've also conceded 8 goals in 4 games, and they actually have the 3rd worst expected against tally in the Bundesliga. And it's more or less level with Gladbach and Bochum, who I would say have played better teams so far, because bearing in mind that so far Mainz have played Union Berlin, Stuttgart, okay, of course, Stuttgart, but then they've played Werder Bremen and Augsburg. And they've done okay to walk away with 1 win and 2 draws from that game, but the amount of chances that they've given away in all 4 of those games is my main concern. They're just simply shipping way too many chances in these games, and it's a huge concern because obviously Burkhardt's a fantastic player. I would go so far as to say he's probably definitely one of the best kind of strikers in the division in that regard. But while they're maybe scraping results and quite happy with obviously where they sit in the league table right now, which is 10th with 5 points in 4 games, I do kind of worry that if they're shipping that many chances against those teams, what are they going to do when they start playing more kind of top half teams? Because he's only one man, and him and Amiri, for example, they can't outscore a broken defence. We saw it with Bayern last season. Even Harry Kane couldn't outscore a broken defence. So I feel like I've maybe put a negative spin on what should be a moment just to celebrate Burkhardt as a player. So maybe if you want to talk about him, by all means. But I just thought I'd address that question about the top half. I think it'll be very difficult unless they can really fix that back line and stop conceding so many chances.
No, and I fully agree with your overall assessment of Mainz. I did point them out in our transfer bonus show a couple of weeks ago that I thought, they hadn't done enough. As for Burkhardt, he's a really interesting player. He's one of those young German strikers that burst onto the scene, and I have his market value curve in front of me right now, Stefan, on Transfermarkt, which I thought is really interesting because he comes into the league right in 2021, has a market value of 6.5 million, and then he just shoots up in that season to in December he's at 17 million, right? Stays there until the end of that season in 2022, and it drops 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 all the way to 7 million. And then he has, before that injury, a really good season last year, and then has sort of confirmed that with his form to start the season this year, and he's going now slightly back up to 12 million euros. I think what happened here, to translate this, is that a young player comes into the league. There's a lot of excitement. He's playing a position that at the time, and this is something that Germany's slowly but surely there's more depth developing for the German national team there, isn't there? And in the center forward position, and he's certainly going to be part of that conversation because at 24, we notice now more and more about center forwards. They seem to mature a little bit later, or a lot of them seem to mature a little bit later. But I think what happened here is there's a lot of hype right away, right? And then it didn't quite pan out. So the expectations lowered and lowered and lowered until, he was 22, 23. And then all of a sudden realized, oh, maybe the hype was justified, but it just took a little bit of time. And I think we're in that stage of his career. He just turned 24. He turned 24 in July 11th. So he's born in 2000. He will be around 26 when the next World Cup comes around, which is a perfect age for center forward, right? And I think what really stands out here then for me is if he can keep this goal scoring pace. Let's say he scores between 15 and 20 goals for Mainz, and this is maybe the answer that Mainz fans don't want to hear. Maybe I'm gonna be the bringer of bad news, Matthew. But if he keeps scoring like this, I suspect he will be at a club that plays Champions League next year, right? Because that is usually what happens. And that is bad news for Mainz, because I fully agree with your assessment. He is an incredible player that can play all sorts of attacking roles, right? He can play center forward, supporting striker, attacking midfield, a little bit like Dennis Undav that way. And we all know how valuable his profile is. So yeah, I think we are fully aware of what Burkhardt is bringing to the table, and thankfully after an initial hype and a little bit of initial disappointment that was maybe a bit premature, he's now showing what he can actually do.
Yeah, I think Mainz are maybe a little lucky in his misfortune, I guess, in the way that when he picked up his injury, because now this is going to sound a little serious or negative, and I really don't want to make it sound like I was kind of wishing harm on anyone, but after that kind of breakthrough kind of 21-22 season, if he'd had another campaign like that, you would probably really struggle to imagine Mainz holding on to him.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, they've been allowed to kind of have another full season out of him. Last year, he did quite well. I would say more or less like back to his best for Mainz. And this season, he started the season really well. He's kicked on. He's as I mentioned, he's got 3 goals in his first 4 games. His XG per 90 is 0.64 per game. Last year it was 0.4. He's actually averaging the highest XG per 90 since he started playing in the Bundesliga. And now look, that's worth. We have to put it into context. Like I mentioned, if I'm going to say Mainz should have done better to not concede chances against these lesser sides, I should also point out that Burkhardt's created a lot of chances probably because they've played these lesser sides. So it's a two-way street with these sort of things. But if you can continue that kind of average of 0.64 XG and also create a lot of chances, I don't expect him to continue scoring at the rate he has been scoring. He certainly didn't over the course of his season, and that breakthrough season in 21-22, when he got 11 goals in the league, he averaged about 0.46. So even if it drops off by about 10%, 15%, it's still a lot higher than he did in his best season, if you will. But yeah, as you said, Mainz are a club who don't really think twice when they sell players. Brian Gruda obviously moved for record fee this summer. And he's obviously going to go on to become a great player, you'd imagine, for the German national team and for Brighton. But there's Diallo who moved to Dortmund. There's go all the way back to Jon Cordoba, the Colombian striker, who moved to Cologne once upon a time. André Schürrle, probably another kind of favorite son of Cologne. Of Mainz. So
Lewis Holtby is another one, right?
Yeah,
Shalai originally too. What was it called? The Brook Street Boys, number. I think they called them.
Yeah, there's a whole list of Mohamed Zidane. Remember him? So they've got a long history of developing players and selling them if and when a good offer comes in for them. So as you said, I'd imagine Burkhardt to move on if he has another good season. But luckily for Mainz, it looks like they're going to get a good campaign out of him. And I think it'll be necessary for them to stay, I'm not quite willing to say they're going to avoid relegation here or avoid the threat of relegation because it's still too early. And like I said, I am really quite concerned by those defensive numbers. But if there's one thing that should help guys like Matthew to sleep at night, it is the fact that they've got Burkhardt in that team, because he seems to be almost single-handedly fighting off those goals conceded and helping them pick up decent results.
Yeah, I think Aaron Demidijovic is a really interesting comparable here. in terms of what can happen, right? So, Burkhardt, a great player. Interesting match against Heidenheim. I think that's going to be because Heidenheim have now lost 2, right? And against Dortmund, that one game, I thought where they really played well, and then they lost to Freiburg in a game that they probably wanted to win. So now Heidenheim are facing a team like Mainz, and again, they're in the same region of form. 2 teams. I think Heidenheim maybe a bit more balanced as a squad, but also maybe come down to earth a little bit more. So this is I actually think that is one of the more interesting matches to watch on Saturday. How will Mainz respond today? They win in the last match day, and then of course Heidenheim to do their 2 defeats, and this is not a far trip either. Although Heidenheim doesn't have a direct train connection, so I hope they're taking the bus. So yeah, but I think that's actually one of the matches I would tune into on the Saturday. I think a really interesting fixture overall.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating one, and it is a kind of really interesting yardstick for where Mainz are right now. Heidenheim are absolutely no pushovers, and as you said, they're maybe having a bit of a kind of Jekyll and Hyde start to the season. After a really good start, they are, as you said, quite surprised. But then Freiburg are a very good team. We talked about that last week as well, so I'm not entirely surprised they struggled there. But yeah, you'd expect Heidenheim to be looking at that fixture saying, right, we need to kind of get back to winning ways here. So it'll be up to Mainz, and in particular that defence, to prove that they are capable of really settling into that mid-table this season. And I think how they do in this Heidenheim game will be a really good example or a good test for them to see what they do. If they can grind out a good result here, keep a clean sheet, keep it down to 1 goal maybe, then I'd be optimistic for Mainz. But I think if they go there, ship 2 or 3 goals, and are really relying on Burkhardt to kind of pull them out of the fire, then, we might see quite a lot of trouble from them this season.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, I think we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to wrap up the questions here. Thank you so much for submitting them, and I think this is a format that works quite well that we'll probably do again, I would assume. As always, this episode of the King Pressing Podcast is brought to you by Bet-Online. Never forget the sponsors. And Stefan, any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, just looking forward to a good weekend of football.
Fantastic stuff. All right. We'll be back next week with the usual round of content. And until then, auf Wiedersehen.